Okay, we are going to move into a section about different interventions that you can use when working with trauma clients. The first one that I have thought of is what I call just a trauma timeline. And this is something that you can use with any clients as you're doing the assessment phase and trying to figure out the different types of trauma that have happened. Or this is also another really good tool that you could use while you, or if you're in a situation in which there kind of is a block in treatment or you've reached a roadblock. This is also another thing that would be really good to use at the beginning of doing trauma therapy because it is very, very cognitive in its nature. So some of you all might have heard me use this analogy before, but I wanted to just go ahead and use it again in terms of the trauma timeline. When I discuss trauma with clients, one of the things that usually is their fear initially is that they would have to dive right into the trauma and not have the appropriate tools to cope with the different trauma, to know how to relax, to use emotions effectively and appropriately, like to their use. And so the trauma timeline is something that I view as cognitive, and the way that I describe it first to them is that the way I introduce trauma to my clients is similar to getting into a pool, like a swimming pool. There's two different ways that you can get into a swimming pool. The first way is to cannonball into it. So this would be just kind of jumping right in, not really sure where you're going, what you're doing. It's a very powerful way. You're going to jump right into it. You might not even know how to swim, but you think about getting into a pool, half the fun is just the cannonball. So that way might seem a little bit scary to clients, but there's also another way you can get into a pool, and that might be that you take a step in, kind of feel around it, wait around it, feel like you're safe in that spot, and then maybe you take a step further, or you take a step back. But all the while, you can kind of look back and you can always see the shore or the side of the pool. And that's another way that you can get into a pool. And I view trauma as the same way. In some ways, we could cannonball into the trauma and just talk about it, all the feelings and the emotions and the thoughts and all of those sorts of things. But that in and of itself might seem very scary to a client. So another really good way to approach trauma is to allow a client to take one step in and know that they have safety and control. Remember, in a traumatic situation, oftentimes part of the trauma is that the client doesn't feel like they have a sense of control over what's going on. So this approach allows a client to take one step, to feel like they have control, to feel safe in that step before they take another step. So I always view a trauma timeline as something that is very much like the first step or the second step into talking about trauma. It's very cognitive. So in this process, we're not necessarily asking our clients to talk about all the feelings that they felt with it. We're not asking them to talk about distortions. We're not there to give them advice about each step of the trauma process. All we're doing within that trauma timeline is just basically getting the facts out. We are making a list chronologically of how the trauma happened, when it happened, where it happened, those sorts of things. This is a great first step into talking about trauma because it's often important for the client to just relay that information and those details before they have to move into it. So this is a really safe way for them to share their story without feeling too overwhelmed. And if they do, they can always, move back to the shore and they can just take a break for the day or maybe take a momentary break and then continue on with it. So that's a trauma timeline. The second intervention I wanted to mention was what I call the trauma egg. Now, I recognize that this is a little bit backwards for you in the way that I'm recording it. But what I do with a client when I'm doing the trauma egg is that I characterize, there's 4 different corners on this paper. In the 4 different corners, what we have the client do is list in this corner the family rules. That could be unspoken family rules, spoken family rules. This is the way that the family functions in order to maintain that homeostasis. If y'all have been through the marriage and family class, you'll be very familiar with homeostasis or status quo, what that is. The other corner, you're going to